Please pray with me. Gracious God, may the meditations of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be a pleasing offering to you, O God, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. You know, fundamentalists can be so funny. Reading our Matthew text for this morning reminded me of something from my past in that segment of Christianity. Like us mainliners, fundamentalists have Bibles that have explanatory notes in them. And I was remembering something my Bible had said about this gospel passage. Because you see, fundamentalists believe the Bible has to be 100% error-free. So what do you do when Jesus says that salt can lose its saltiness? That is something that is physically impossible. You have to do some pretty creative mental gymnastics. And this morning, as I was doing a little Google search, I found a post defending the factuality of that statement by claiming that a single grain of salt, if left alone, would lose its flavor. Well, that's very interesting. Salt isn't like nutmeg or, some spice like that. No, it doesn't work that way. Another example later in the Gospel of Matthew is when Jesus is arrested, Peter takes out a sword and cuts off the ear of one of the high priest's servants. I've heard some fundamentalists interpret that passage as a defense of the right to bear arms. But is that actually the point of that story? No. Because the gospel writer tells us exactly what the point of that is. He who lives by the sword will die by it. That's just a tad different. Now, most of us would not identify as fundamentalists here. It's easy to make fun of people who are different than we are. But it's a little harder to see it in ourselves. But it's a very human impulse to focus in on one small piece of the puzzle and kind of miss the big picture. What is it we say? Miss the forest for the trees? I've been in church board meetings where we go over some minute detail for way too long. And it isn't until it's all over that I realize, oh shoot, we totally missed the point, didn't we? We totally forgot what was important. Now, our first reading is from the book of Isaiah. This passage comes from what scholars refer to as 3rd Isaiah. Very original, I know. It is written after the Jews returned from the Babylonian exile. Not only do these returnees, are they in desperate need of reassurance that God is with them, all their cities were destroyed, including the temple, but they also need to know how to rebuild their entire civilization. The prophet in this reading is urging the people to ground their society on God's justice. As from our reading from the prophet Micah, this prophet tells the people that God doesn't like empty ritual. Piety needs to serve the needs of the community. And following God needs to be the basis of the rebuilding of society for them. Our second reading continues in Paul's first letter to the Corinthians, where Paul, like the prophet in Isaiah, is encouraging the people to live in accordance with God's wishes. Last week we read how Paul talked at length about how human strength and human wisdom was not able to comprehend what God was doing in Jesus Christ. Here Paul reminds the church in Corinth that he didn't come to them with flowery speech and flashy presentation. God's wisdom and God's power, Paul argues, comes to us through the suffering of the cross. That seemingly shameful act was the ultimate revelation of God. God meets us in our suffering. The church comes together in the shadow of the cross. The cross is etched on us. What does it mean to be a people whose very existence was forged in the suffering and death of God? Now, our gospel reading continues that theme of how the community is to live together. Last week's reading began on the Sermon on the Mount, and here we continue on the Sermon on the Mount. Unfortunately, however, this year, because the season of Epiphany only has 6 Sundays, we will have to cut our little talk about the Sermon on the Mount short this year. But in our reading today, Jesus uses 2 metaphors to describe the community of faith: salt and light. Now, salt, you might know, was an important flavor enhancer and a preservative in the ancient world. Now, we might have a little trouble with that particular metaphor because salt of the earth is an expression that we use today, isn't it? Those people are salt of the earth. But the trouble is with that is that expression means something very different than what it meant in Jesus' time. For us, salt of the earth means we use it for people who are very down to earth, very free of drama, very plain and ordinary, but in a good way, right? That's how we use salt of the earth here. But that's not what Jesus meant. Salt of the earth people in Jesus' time was something that stood out, that made a real mark. Flavoring, preservative, right? Something that stands out. And that's why light is also used as a metaphor here, because it's something that stands out. And there are also a couple funny sayings here. Funny, maybe not haha, but kind of, mild chuckle. After all, salt doesn't lose its saltiness. That is physically impossible. So I imagine that some of Jesus' audience must have brought a chuckle to some of them. And also, hiding your lamp under a bushel basket. Nobody would do that. It's an open flame. You put your basket on top of what's going to happen. You're going to lose your basket. But also notice something interesting about this passage. This is not an invitation from Jesus. This is a statement. Or for those of you who are English majors out there, the indicative mood. It's a declared state. You are salt. You are light. To be the church is not to just exist for yourself. It's to exist for the world. You can't keep your faith to yourself, even if you tried. At least that seems to be the way that Matthew's Jesus is telling it. And notice also the last paragraph of our reading. The Gospel of Matthew has a very positive view of Jewish law. And unlike some of the other Gospels and the writings of Paul, Matthew's Jesus reaffirms the law and the prophets. Not one iota of the law will pass away, which is funny because that joke literally only makes sense in Greek. And Jesus supposedly didn't speak Greek. So you can tell somebody was having a little fun with that. But the Gospel of Matthew also has quite a bit of contempt for those who should know better when they fail to live up to God's standards. And because it's bad enough to fall short, but it's even worse to teach others to fall short. And the righteousness of the Jesus community must exceed that of the religious leaders of the time. Now, there's a piece in that gospel reading that I do want to touch upon as a side note because I feel it needs to be talked about a little bit. As I mentioned, the Gospel of Matthew has a very high view of the Jewish law. The writer of Matthew really harps on the need to be righteous. And that language can be a little scary to us. We might wonder whether or not we're good enough for God. So I want to point out something important here before I go on. Notice that as hard as Matthew's Jesus is on those who lead others astray, they're not excluded from the kingdom of heaven. They are merely demoted to a lower status. Important to keep that in mind. Because although our righteousness does matter, God's grace always plays a larger role. But so what is the point here? What is truly important? Well, all three Bible readings talk about the importance of community, the value in holding the group together and resisting those things that can harm the community. All three Bible readings talk about how we are to relate to each other as individuals. Do we act towards each other with love? Do we act toward each other with justice? And all three Bible readings also talk about how we relate to the larger world. Our individuals, our communities have an impact on the world. We are a people of mission, which comes from the Latin word mittere, to send. We are sent into the world. Our individual and communal actions need to always support our mission. We are the salt of the earth. We exist to flavor and preserve. We are the light of the world. We exist to illumine for others. What is it I like to say? We are blessed to be Good. So that brings us to my main point here. We are the salt and light of this world. Whether we like it or not, it's our identity. And that's who we are. It's kind of like being a brother, a sister, a daughter, or a son. If you're one of those things, you just are. You don't get to have a choice. Oh, and cousin. I forgot about cousin. We always forget about cousins, though, don't we? That reality, salt and light, is at the core of our being. So it always needs to be front and center. Because as amazing as our church bylaws are, and I must say they are the most amazing, just kidding, they must always serve the mission of this church, to be the salt and the light to the world. And as amazing as our church building is, and it's seriously, we have an awesome building, but it must always serve the mission of this church to be the salt and the light. And as amazing as our public statements and our advocacy, we have some pretty cool statements and we've done some incredible advocacy. Nevertheless, it must always serve the mission of this church to be the salt and the light to the world. H. Richard Niebuhr, one of our greatest theologians in the United Church of Christ, he taught at some school in New England, I think. Do you remember what school it was, Deb, that he taught at? Anyway, he and his brother, there was some rivalry between those two Niebuhr brothers. But anyway, he was one of our greatest theologians. But when he was asked about the purpose of something as arcane as theological education, he said that the purpose of theological education, which in fact is really the purpose of the church and its mission, is the increase of love of God and neighbor among all people. The purpose is the increase of love of God and neighbor among people. What an insightful expression of the point of this all. As salt and light of the world, we stand for the increase of love of God and love of neighbor. Too often churches forget about that. Too often churches get tied down by all the weight of the past. Too often churches get tied down by all those institutional challenges, balancing the budget, keeping the roof from leaking. Yes, those are all important things, by the way. But what's really important is the work for the increase of love of God and love of neighbor. That's the real point. The real mission as the salt and light of the world.